G'day ladies and gents, welcome to my tutorial series on YouTube on learning C++ for either the beginner in all of you or if you're just trying to pick up a new language. Anything goes here, alright? So we're going to run over a few quick questions for the beginner who's aspiring to learn, and we're also going to help set up all the software that's needed for programming in C++. So, we're going to start by installing the IDE and all the packages just because it takes time, and while we're doing it, I can explain all the questions. So I have the link right over here, visualstudio.microsoft.com, and open that up in your web browser. You're greeted with this nice purple Microsoft page. So, go over here, Visual Studio IDE, download Visual Studio, Community 2019. Click that. Your download should start automatically, or after a brief delay, because Microsoft is slow, as always. In any case, it'll start up. You can do your thing. Download it, open it up. Once we're done, and everything starts up properly, we should be greeted with this screen. Now, I already went ahead and downloaded it, of course, but I am going to do a complete fresh install of Visual Studio, just so we don't have any issues with compatibility, or if I accidentally skipped a step somewhere. So the first thing you want to do from here is under the Workloads tab, set up Desktop Development with C++. Just select that. Should be alright. You'll see all this other stuff on the side. Most of it's not that important, honestly. At least for the beginner. If you're advanced, then yeah, you might want to have certain things installed, certain things not installed, just depending on which version of C++ you're using. But for us, the defaults are going to be alright. That should be the only thing we really need in particular, because, I mean, we're not doing Linux development, we're not doing game development, or mobile development. We're doing Windows development, or desktop development. So this should be the only one we need to select. If you want to add a different language pack, you can do that as well. I mean, I just speak English, French, Polish, a few other languages, but in any case, I'm just going to stick with English for the sake of simplicity and keeping it standard. You can have a look at your individual components. Most of it is mostly unnecessary unless you do want to start developing with C# or Python or anything else. I am going to install a few extra things just because I do program in multiple languages and I do like using Visual Studio for that. So forgive me while I just select everything I want. What was I missing? Don't think anything actually. I want the latest Windows 10 SDK. Alright, I think that's about it. If you want, you can change your installation locations, or in other words, the path where your Visual Studio install will be installed. Again, this really is mostly preference. The defaults are fine. I'm just going to use the defaults. If you want to keep the download cache after installation, you can do that. It does take up almost 3 gig, but it's up to you. So you'll see the total space required down here. It's 11 gig. It's getting kind of close to 12 gig as well, so you're going to want at least that much available for you. At least that's if you're installing all the other packages that I added. You don't really need them, like F# and C#. So it might be a little bit less, but in any case, make sure you don't exceed however much available space you have. You can choose to install while downloading or download all then install. Honestly, it doesn't really matter. Again, it's up to preference. I think install while downloading is a little bit faster though. And get started, hit install. So, while that's doing its thing in the background, we're going to go over these 4 questions right here. First of all, before you even start programming, you need to understand what programming is. So, essentially, you've probably heard the notion that computers only understand zeros and ones, binary or whatever, like that. You hear about bits, you hear about bytes, all that stuff. And at some level, or well, at its most fundamental level rather, that's completely true. If you open up any program in, let's say, Notepad or something, you're going to get all kinds of random gibberish up on the screen. But each character that you see there, and even some that you don't see, they all participate in this grander scheme of things with your code. And the computer will know how to understand that when it's actually trying to run that code. Now, what programming essentially is, although you can theoretically write in those zeros and ones if you really wanted to, that's how 1970s worked, you don't have to do that anymore nowadays. You have these higher level languages, and C++, although it's a little bit of a lower level language, it's technically a high level. So instead of having to write with zeros and ones, we can have all kinds of different statements like print, if, for. We have much more higher level concepts that we can add to our code. And C++ is nice in the sense that it actually has a lot of features, and it still has very small file sizes once everything is set up and you can run your application. So, what is a compiler now? Well, like we were saying, computers only really understand zeros and ones, bits and bytes. It's not going to understand the code that you write, because the code that you're going to be writing has a lot of like English words, and it doesn't really understand English, right? So what a compiler does is it's a different piece of software that essentially goes through your code, and it starts to convert all the statements that you wrote and all the data and all that stuff into machine code, or the bits and bytes, zeros and ones. So every time we write some code, we're going to have to compile it with the compiler. Now, in Visual Studio, that's extremely easy. It's literally just hitting a button. If you are on Linux, it might be a little bit more difficult, and there's a whole field of study related to compiler optimization. But we're not going to deal with any of that, mainly because it's difficult, it's complicated, and for our purposes, it's pretty unnecessary. So, next question, what is an IDE? Well, an IDE is essentially what we're installing right here. Visual Studio Community 2019. The free, fully featured IDE for students, open source, and individual developers, according to Microsoft. IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment. When you break it down from there, development environment, so it's a place where you can write code, let's say. It's a place where you can do development. And it's integrated because it has all kinds of other features within it. So you have like your regular text editor that you can write code in. You'll also have easy access to the compiler. Like I said, with Visual Studio, it's as easy as clicking a button. But Visual Studio, you saw, it's like 12 gigabytes that I'm installing here, or the default Visual Studio itself is 3 gig, and that's absolutely huge for a text editor, right? Like look at Notepad. This Visual Studio is essentially Notepad except with fancier colors. So what does Visual Studio do differently? Well, it has features like linting, so it'll find pieces of code that maybe aren't really doing anything that important, and we'll figure out different ways to either get rid of it or ways to rewrite it. It'll also help you fix all your errors or any warnings that you get. We're going to be getting a few of those later on in our more advanced programs and the later parts of this tutorial. But all you need to know for now is that it does have a lot of features, and it's just going to make our lives a lot easier than using a different IDE, say Code Blocks or VS Code or something like that. The last question is, I suppose it's based around preference. So when someone asks how hard C++ is, it really depends how much experience you have, how much knowledge of like logic and math you have. Not saying that you need to know a lot of math to program, that's definitely not the case, but if you aren't able to think logically, you're already going to have a harder time at programming. In C++ itself, like I mentioned, it's a very low-level language. It has a lot of features built into it, but the notation for those features can be a little bit confusing. And you're able to do a lot more things related to really low-level, down-to-the-metal processing. So for the beginner, it might be really difficult to pick up. But that being said, once you learn C++ and you get at least to an intermediate level with it, understanding object-oriented concepts, understanding a bit about algorithms, data structures, then you'll start to realize that because you have all the knowledge behind you, it'll make learning any other language 100 times easier. Once you start learning a new language, you're going to realize that all the concepts behind the language and behind programming as a whole are mostly the same, and the only thing that's really changing between languages is the syntax. And if anything, let's say you're using Python afterwards, and Python's a very, very high-level language. You can't really do as much of the low-level processing and manipulation by default, but there usually is a way to do something like that. For an example, we have the CPython framework that lets you call C functions, and C++ is basically C's bigger brother, so a lot of the concepts, again, are going to completely carry over when you're learning another language. So with all that out of the way, we're going to wait until Visual Studio installs, and then I'll just run you through how to open it up, create a new project, and all that other bare bones stuff. Alright, I'm back, and sure enough, Visual Studio Installer says that it has fully installed. I can launch it or modify it or anything like that, repair on install. Don't worry about the configurations, but pretty much anything you do, changing the application now, will be done through Visual Studio Installer. So we can close that, we're done with it, and if you had the checkbox checked earlier while it was installing / downloading, it would have automatically started. If not, go to your Start menu, click Visual Studio, all done. So you can close your Visual Studio installer now, and on your first setup you will likely get asked about having to log into a Microsoft account or something like that. Honestly, it's not super important, in my opinion. I think it's just Microsoft trying to spy on you as usual. But yeah, log in if you have to, then Visual Studio 2019 is free for you to use. So, I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Get ready for Chapter 1.